They say the Victorian lady was the epitome of grace, a floating vision of satin, pearls, and poise. She moved like a dream, soft glides, delicate fans, and practiced silence. But beneath that grace, there was discomfort. There were secrets. And one of them was, how on earth did she go to the bathroom? Because no one ever spoke of it. Not in society, not in books, not even in the pages of a personal diary. And yet it was always there. That quiet, unspoken fact that no amount of perfume or pearls could hide. Even queens need to pee. But in a world ruled by appearances, such truths were forbidden. The Victorian woman wasn't allowed to be human. She was allowed to be beautiful, composed, pure, even if it meant hiding pain, suppressing needs, and tying herself into cages of lace and steel. Because everything about her was performance. Every step she took in public was measured. Every word she spoke rehearsed. Even her stillness had choreography. And under her gown, not just one layer, not two, but sometimes over 10 different components stitched, fastened, laced, and weighted. It was like walking inside an armored chandelier, beautiful, but crushing, breathtaking, but breathless, every curve restrained, every need delayed. But in that vast architecture of fabric and etiquette, there was one design flaw they never discussed. Her body still had functions. Her body still had limits. So how did she deal with that? What did she do when nature called? That's the story we'll uncover tonight. Because to truly understand the cost of beauty in the Victorian age, we must go not to the ballroom, but behind the dressing screen, into bedrooms, into silence, into shame. This isn't just a story about bathroom routines. It's a story about control, about sacrifice, about what it meant to be a woman in an era where even your bladder had to behave. Before we can talk about what it was like to use the bathroom in a Victorian dress, we need to understand what women were wearing, because the truth is, it wasn't just a dress. It was an entire machine of modesty. Victorian fashion was less about comfort and more about control over the body, the posture, the silhouette, and the soul. And it all started with the very first layer, the chemise. The chemise was usually made of plain white cotton. It was loose, thin, and worn directly on the skin. It served as a barrier, absorbing sweat and protecting outer garments from body oils. Because, remember, laundering a corset or a gown was nearly impossible. Over the chemise came the drawers, or as they were often called, open crotch drawers. These were loose knee-length underpants made of cotton or linen. But here's the shocker. They were intentionally split down the middle, left open between the legs. Why? Because with 10 or more layers to undress, women needed a way to relieve themselves without fully undressing. This design wasn't flawed. It was intentional. It was a secret sewn into silence, never discussed in polite company, but understood by every woman who had to use it. Next came the corset. The corset. The most famous and most misunderstood garment in history. Corsets weren't just about slimming the waist. They were about reshaping the torso entirely. Boning made from whalebone, steel, or cane created an artificial silhouette, flattening the stomach, lifting the bust, and forcing the spine into a rigid posture. Laced from the back, often by a maid, corsets could be adjusted to squeeze a woman's waist into idealized measurements, 20 inches, 18 inches, even 16 inches. But this wasn't without cost. Corsets compressed internal organs. They limited breathing capacity, and over time, they retrained the body to hold itself unnaturally. A corseted woman couldn't easily bend at the waist. She couldn't sit comfortably, and she certainly couldn't squat to use the bathroom without risk of fainting. On top of the corset came the crinoline, an enormous bell-shaped frame made of steel hoops. The crinoline created the signature wide skirt of the era, sometimes up to 6 feet in diameter. It was a cage, literally. Its size forced women to walk through doors sideways, to sit on only the widest settees, to stand apart from others, lest they crush their own skirt. And yet, society called this look graceful. Once the crinoline was on, the woman would layer petticoats over it, soft cotton or stiffened linen to add shape, weight, and modesty. Then came the actual gown, an overskirt, often pleated or bustled, a matching bodice, tightly fastened with hooks or buttons, a sash, a belt, maybe a small train for evening wear, and of course, no woman was complete without accessories, long gloves, a bonnet or hat, a parasol, a fan, and perhaps a handbag so small it held nothing useful at all. Altogether, the average fashionable outfit of a Victorian lady weighed between 10 and 20 pounds. Some formal gowns, layered for winter or court events, weighed even more. The materials trapped heat in the summer and moisture in the winter. The boning in corset cut into the skin, and the crinoline was so wide it posed real danger. Women often caught fire from open hearths, or got caught in carriage wheels. But still, they wore them, every day, because to be seen without it was to risk shame. And it wasn't just about fashion, it was about discipline. How well you wore your dress said something about your character, your respectability, your upbringing, your marriageability. If you looked tired, rumpled, or sweaty under the weight, you were considered weak. If you walked awkwardly, your mother hadn't raised you properly. If you complained, you were vulgar. A lady did not sweat. A lady did not strain. A lady did not, under any circumstance, acknowledge the existence of her body's natural needs. So now, let's return to the question, what happened when she needed to use the bathroom? Because by the time she felt the need to go, she was already wearing a chemise, drawers, a corset, a crinoline, 2 petticoats, a skirt, a bodice, and maybe even a bustle. None of it easy to lift, none of it easy to remove, none of it possible to manage without help. Before we can truly understand how Victorian women used a bathroom, we need to understand what they were wearing. Because the truth is, they weren't simply putting on a dress each morning. What they wore was an elaborate, layered system and engineered structure of modesty and shape, designed more for appearance than practicality. A woman's clothing in this era wasn't just fabric, it was expectation, it was identity, and more often than not, it was confinement. The very first layer to touch the body was the chemise. This was a simple white shift made of cotton, loose, lightweight, and unadorned. It served a practical purpose, to absorb sweat and protect the more expensive outer garments from skin contact. Laundry was difficult and expensive, so the chemise acted like a washable shield between a woman's body and her beautiful, unwashable dresses. Over the chemise came the drawers, undergarments that might surprise you. These weren't the fully enclosed knickers we think of today. Victorian drawers were open at the crotch. Yes, split down the middle. Not torn, not broken, designed that way. The reason was simple. Once a woman was fully dressed, undressing again would be a monumental task. The open design allowed her to relieve herself discreetly and without needing to remove everything. It was a quiet compromise between function and form, one rarely spoken of, even among women. Next came the corset, perhaps the most iconic piece of Victorian fashion. Made with whalebone or steel stays and laced tightly at the back, the corset was used to mold the female body into the fashionable shape of the day. It cinched the waist, lifted the bust, flattened the stomach, and straightened the spine. A tightly laced corset could reduce a woman's waist by several inches, creating the prized hourglass figure that society so adored. But beauty came at a price. Corsets restricted breathing, shifted organs, and prevented easy movement. Women couldn't bend fully at the waist, they couldn't slouch, and they certainly couldn't sit comfortably for long periods. And remember, these were worn not for special occasions, but often every day. Once the corset was in place, the real structure began. Enter the crinoline, a massive bell-shaped frame made of hoops of steel or horsehair. This was what gave Victorian skirts their enormous volume, making women appear larger than life, ethereal and untouchable. But the crinoline was no mere fashion statement. It was a physical cage. It spread out around the woman like an extension of her body, forcing her to move carefully, turn sideways through doorways, and remain perpetually aware of her physical presence in the space around her. The crinoline alone could be several feet wide and impossible to manage without help. Over the crinoline came one or more petticoats, meant to soften the lines of the hoops and preserve modesty. Then came the overskirt and bodice-matching pieces that completed the look. The bodice was fitted tightly to the torso, often laced or buttoned closed, and the skirt might be pleated, bustled, or even trailed behind in a short train. Gloves, parasols, jewelry, fans, hats, every accessory had its place. Every piece was coordinated, and every detail mattered. By the time she was fully dressed, a woman could be carrying 10 to 20 pounds of fabric and steel. In colder months, or for court appearances, that weight could be even greater. The clothing didn't just restrict her movement, it controlled it. It dictated how she sat, how she stood, how she walked, and how she breathed. And all of this was expected to be done with effortless grace. But the real question remains, what happened when she needed to use the bathroom? Because once you understand what was under the dress, how heavy it was, how tight, how carefully layered, it becomes clear that the simple act of relieving oneself was anything but simple. It wasn't just a matter of modesty. It was a logistical challenge, one that required practice, planning, and, sometimes, the help of another pair of hands. And yet, no one ever talked about it. In the next segment, we'll peel back the last layer of silence and explore what really happened when nature called in a world that demanded silence, stillness, and secrecy. Imagine waking in the middle of the night in a vast Victorian bedroom. The room is cold, lit only by the dying glow of a fireplace or the faint flicker of a candle. Your bed is high and layered. The air smells faintly of lavender and soot, and you are wrapped in a nightdress beneath heavy sheets. You need to relieve yourself, but there is no bathroom, no plumbing, and no privacy, only silence and protocol. Most Victorian homes, even grand ones, had little or no indoor plumbing. If there was a water closet, it might be located on the ground floor or only outside. Upstairs bedrooms, where women spent their nights, rarely had such luxuries. Instead, a ceramic chamber pot was discreetly tucked under the bed or inside a piece of furniture known as a close stool. A wooden chair with a removable seat and a hidden pot inside. Using it was not elegant, but it was necessary. The process required patience and precision. A woman might rise slowly, careful not to disturb her husband or her maid, and lift her nightdress just enough to squat over the pot. If she was wearing a corset, even at night, which some women did, it would be even harder. She would position herself carefully, not to spill, not to soil the layers she could not easily wash. There were no flushes, no sounds of running water, just the muffled splash, the weight of the pot, the creak of the wooden floorboards. In wealthier homes, a maid might be called quietly, with a bell or a knock, to assist in lifting the heavy skirts, holding a lantern, or discreetly taking away the full chamber pot once the deed was done. These maids were trained to be silent, invisible. Their job was not just to clean, but to preserve the illusion of effortless dignity, and so, even in the privacy of one's own room, a woman could not be entirely alone. She could not fully undress. She could not fully relax. Her body was expected to obey quietly, invisibly, as part of the performance of womanhood. During the day, things weren't much easier. In parlors and drawing rooms, where women might spend hours entertaining guests, there were rarely designated restrooms. Instead, the same chamber pot or close stool was used, often placed behind a screen or in a corner. Using it meant lifting skirts, balancing over hoops and petticoats, and aiming carefully, sometimes with the assistance of a servant. The open crotch drawers made this possible, but not easy. It required balance, it required experience, and above all, it required silence. There were no toilet papers. Instead, cloth rags or scraps of soft linen were used, washed, dried, and reused, sometimes by the lady herself, more often by her maid. In less wealthy homes, these cloths might be shared, and in poorer households, anything available might be used: leaves, newspaper, or old fabric, and then thrown into a pit or burned. Menstruation brought its own set of challenges. Victorian women had no access to modern pads or tampons. Instead, they used sanitary cloths, which were layers of folded fabric, tied around the waist or pinned into undergarments. These had to be changed frequently, washed discreetly, and hidden from sight. The risk of staining an expensive gown was constant and carried real social consequences. A single spot on a petticoat could result in scandal, or at the very least, embarrassment. So women learned to prepare. They drank less water, especially on days when they'd be out for long periods. They avoided tea during afternoon visits. They trained their bodies to wait, to endure. A well-bred lady was expected to control not only her emotions, but her digestion and bladder as well. Bladders, like corsets, were trained. There was an art to holding it in, to hiding discomfort behind a composed face. To excuse oneself for the bathroom during a social visit would be considered impolite. It simply wasn't done. If a woman desperately needed relief, she might excuse herself to a quiet room where a maid could assist. But even then, it was a whispered affair, one that left no trace and no discussion afterward. At night, the act of relieving oneself became a ritual. A woman might prepare her chamber, pot before bed, placing it within reach. She might ensure her maid had emptied it, scented it with dried lavender or rose petals, and lined it with cloth to reduce sound. She might rise at dawn to ensure she had used it before anyone else stirred. And she would never, ever speak of it, because to speak of it, to acknowledge the body's needs, was to break the illusion. Victorian womanhood was not about honesty. It was about maintaining a facade, one of cleanliness, restraint, purity, and grace. Even in the most private moments, a lady was expected to remain composed. Her bodily functions were not her own. They were something to be hidden, managed, and, if possible, denied. And all of this was considered normal. In the next segment, we'll ask, what happened when she wasn't at home? When she was out shopping, at the opera, on a train surrounded by society, but with nowhere to go. We're about to uncover the next level of discomfort. The public side of a very private need. At home, at least, a woman could count on the silence of her bedroom and the discreet help of a maid. But outside the house, the situation was far more difficult. And for Victorian women, being out in public didn't just mean enduring tight corsets and crinoline cages. It also meant navigating a world that had no place for their most basic needs. Victorian cities were changing rapidly in the 19th century. Streets were growing busier, shops more abundant, public events more frequent. Women were venturing out more often to attend lectures, stroll in parks, visit dressmakers, or simply escape the boredom of home. But there was one thing the world did not build for them: toilets. Public urinals, known as pissoirs, or gentlemen's conveniences, began appearing in cities like London and Paris during the mid-1800s. These were modest, open structures, often placed at street corners or near parks, designed to give men a discreet and convenient place to relieve themselves. But for women, nothing. The Victorian worldview saw a woman's need to urinate as not just private, but almost non-existent. It was considered too vulgar, too shameful, too animalistic to acknowledge that women had the same bodily functions as men. As a result, there were virtually no public restrooms for women, not in department stores, not in theaters, not in museums. So what did women do? Many simply trained themselves not to go. They carefully managed their fluid intake, avoiding tea, broth, or water before any outing. Some women even abstained from eating or drinking for hours beforehand, just to avoid the risk of needing a toilet in public. Others relied on strict scheduling. Trips to town were timed precisely so they could return home before nature's call became urgent. Visits to friends were sometimes cut short, and long carriage rides, those were endured in silence, with clenched muscles and a painful burning patience. For wealthier women, there were secret tools. One of the most curious was the urinette, a portable urinal shaped like a funnel or cup, made of ceramic, rubber, or tin. Tucked beneath the crinoline, a woman could use it while standing, often while crouching slightly over a hidden pot. Some carriages were designed with hidden chamber pots beneath the seats, allowing discreet relief during long journeys. These contraptions were awkward, risky, and rarely spoken of, but they were a lifeline for those who had no other option. Still, these solutions were mostly limited to the elite. Middle and working class women had fewer choices. If they found themselves in town for too long, with no access to a friend's home or no maid to shield them, they had to either hold it in or risk using an alley, a garden corner, or a dirty, unsafe public privy one, shared by laborers, drunks, and strangers. And even then, they faced judgment for being seen near such places. The absence of public toilets wasn't just inconvenient. For many women, it was a form of silent control. It dictated where they could go, how long they could stay, and how far they could travel. In essence, it kept them close to home, and therefore, out of public life. Women's rights activists began to notice this. In fact, one of the first major public debates on women's sanitation was not about health, but about freedom. Reformers argued that the lack of restrooms restricted women's ability to work, attend political meetings, or even walk freely in their cities. If a woman couldn't find a toilet, she couldn't fully participate in society. And so, the bathroom became a symbol, not just of privacy, but of liberty. In London, the Ladies' Sanitary Association was formed in the late 1800s to campaign for public lavatories for women. Their members were often mocked. Newspapers published cartoons of women storming urinals with banners. The very idea of a public toilet for women was treated as obscene, but these activists knew what they were fighting for. They were demanding the simple right to exist in public space, without shame, without secrecy, and without fear. The first female public toilets did eventually appear, but slowly, and only in select cities, often hidden behind high walls, or placed in obscure corners of parks. They were meant to be invisible. The message remained clear: female bodies were not to be seen, nor discussed, nor accommodated openly. And so, for most of the Victorian era, women endured. They endured dry mouths and aching stomachs. They endured discomfort, silence, and shame. They endured the contradiction of being expected to appear elegant and composed, while being given no safe place to meet the most basic needs of life. In many ways, these restrictions shaped the entire experience of being a woman in public. Woman's freedom to move, to shop, to attend a lecture, or visit a friend, all of it was limited by the fact that her body could not be acknowledged. Her natural needs had no place in the world built around her, and so, her time outside the home became a race against her own biology. Even today, echoes of this still remain. In long bathroom lines at concerts, in poorly lit public restrooms, in whispered jokes about women always needing a friend to go with them. It's a legacy of exclusion, one built, ironically, on the silence of centuries. In the next segment, we'll reflect on what this all meant, not just practically, but psychologically. What was the cost of living this way, of needing and never being allowed to need? What did it mean to be a Victorian woman whose body had to be invisible, even to herself? There's something haunting about the silence Victorian women had to carry, not just in words, but in their posture, their expressions, their bodies, every sigh stifled, every discomfort swallowed, every need disguised beneath folds of silk and lace. It's easy to admire the elegance of the Victorian woman, the grace with which she walked, the delicacy of her gloves, the care in her speech. But behind that elegance was a lifelong training in endurance. A woman was taught not just how to walk or curtsy, but how to endure pain without complaint, how to suppress urges without fidgeting, and how to hold back tears or urine with a smile. From girlhood, she was instructed in the fine art of invisibility. She learned to hold her tongue, to control her laughter, and to make herself smaller in every room. Her clothes helped with that. The corset held her upright, the crinoline kept others at a distance, and the countless layers reminded her that her body was not hers to move freely. Her movements were choreographed, her expressions edited, her biology denied. Even the simplest of acts, like going to the bathroom, became a matter of shame, a secret, a burden to be hidden, and over time, that secrecy turned into something deeper, a sense that her natural self was not welcome, that her very nature, her hunger, her emotions, her sweat, her bleeding, her fullness, was improper, embarrassing, unwomanly. Imagine what it does to a person to live year after year in a world where even your most basic functions are not allowed, where you cannot say, "I need to go," where you cannot excuse yourself, or sigh in relief, or ask for help, where every normal impulse must be repressed, and every inconvenience disguised as poise. It teaches you that your body is a problem. It teaches you that to be graceful means to be silent, that to be respectable means to deny yourself, that to be feminine means to be invisible, even to your own needs. This was the hidden cost of being a lady in the Victorian age. The real tragedy is not just that the clothes were heavy, or the toilets were far, or the rules were unfair. The tragedy is that so many women learned to believe that this was how it should be, that their discomfort was natural, that their silence was virtuous, that to endure was to be admired. But grace and suffering are not the same, and beauty should not demand pain today. We look back at their gowns in museums. We marvel at the embroidery, the delicate lace, the impossibly small waists. We call it fashion. We call it art. But rarely do we pause to consider the women beneath. The gowns, the weight they carried, the needs they buried, the lives they lived quietly, elegantly, and invisibly. So perhaps, the next time we admire a portrait of a Victorian lady, we might wonder what she was hiding behind her eyes, whether her feet were aching, whether she needed to breathe more deeply, whether she longed to throw off her corset and simply exhale. This story of bathroom secrets, of layered shame, of engineered elegance, is not just a curiosity of the past. It's a reminder, a whisper from history saying, I was here, I existed, I held it in, and still I smiled. May we remember her not just for how she looked, but for everything she never said.